Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short webinar on the importance of LGBTQ plus role models, particularly in education. Thank you all for joining me on this Wednesday evening. My name is David, and I am an LGBTQ plus education consultant, and I work with schools and other organisations that work with children and young people to make sure that the curriculum and the policies that we have in place are as queer inclusive as possible. So we've only got a short amount of time together this evening. So I just want to kind of go through the kind of outline of the session. So we're going to start by thinking about how the education landscape has changed for LGBTQ plus inclusion. Then we're going to have a look at how education societies see or view the LGBT community. Going to think a little bit about that concept of windows, doors, and mirrors. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with that anyhow. And then think about the impact of when we're designing our curriculum, thinking about the impact that LGBTQ plus role models can have on our students, but also on our staff in school. Just want to start, as I do in every session, to say that this is a safe space. Please feel free to ask those awkward questions or feel that there's going to be no judgment on you if you use the wrong terminology or something along those lines. So please pop things in the chat, raise your hand, and I want this to be as interactive as possible for you to get the most out of the next 20 minutes or so. Okay, so let's start then by thinking about how has the education landscape changed for LGBTQ plus inclusion. And we kind of really have to start by looking at Section 28, which was a piece of legislation under the Local Government Act that came in 1988, and it was in place in England until 2003, although in Scotland it was repealed in the year 2000. So this was a piece of legislation that didn't directly impact schools as such, but did require local authorities not to promote homosexuality as a pretend relationship. Now, of course, because schools, particularly at that time, were run by the local authority, it meant that schools were in this ambiguous place and weren't really too sure what they could and couldn't do. So, of course, they didn't talk about it. And I hope you've been looking at the quotes on the screen there that just shows you what life was like at the time and what our then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had to say on it. So I like to think that we've moved on a bit since then, but this piece of legislation basically meant that we couldn't talk about it. It was effectively, without saying it directly, it had a big impact and a big legacy on teachers and children during that period that meant that basically talking about being gay just didn't happen. It was almost like it was a community that didn't exist. Fortunately, as I said, that was repealed in 2003 in England and 2000 in Scotland. Things have improved. So when we think about education in particular, the Equality Act came in 2010. And there's 9 protected characteristics. So it is now against the law to discriminate against anyone because of these protected characteristics. So for the benefit of this session and talking about LGBTQ plus inclusion and queer education, we're focusing pretty much on gender reassignment and sexual orientation. Those are the 2 main ones that come in for us today. There's also the public sector equality duty that now stipulates, which is part of the Equality Act, that says that every school must publish equality information and objectives, which has to give information and statistics on people that share protected characteristics, which has to be updated every year. And then there must also be equality objectives that must be updated at least every 4 years that link back to the Equality Act and those 9 protected characteristics. In addition to that, schools still need to prepare and implement an accessibility plan, setting out how you'll make improvements for those people with disabilities. So we now have it enshrined in law that there has to be something in place to stop that discrimination against people who are LGBT+. When we think about schools in particular and what exists for schools, and especially, and this is England's context here, first of all, we've got Ofsted, so the Office for Standards in Education. And in their current education framework, their current handbook, they look at equality and diversity in 3 different areas. They'll look at it within leadership. They'll look at it within behaviour and attitudes. They'll think about bullying and homophobic bullying, but also they look at it and the big one really is under personal development, What is it that schools are doing to develop well-rounded individuals that are being taught about protected characteristics and about discrimination and discriminatory language? So there's a whole piece there that schools need to be looking at. The second piece that is important, that particularly mentions being LGBT, is the relationships education guidance, which is under review at the moment. When that new guidance is going to come out, we are not too sure, but it does say that schools are pretty much expected to talk about LGBTQ plus families at an age appropriate time. Now, of course, that's where the ambiguity comes in, because what is age appropriate for you or for me will be different. And then, of course, for parents and for other teachers and leadership teams in your schools. So we're hoping to get some guidance from the DfE on what that's going to look like in the near future. So, of course, we've now got it stipulated in guidance that we need to be talking about being LGBT with our children. And the other bit that came in, which I think from an LGBT perspective is probably the most powerful bit that we have for schools, is keeping children safe in education. So the most recent update was September 2023, but in September 2022, there's now a whole section on LGBT plus children. So it talks about being LGBT in itself. It's not a safeguarding issue. And it also has a really nice sentence in there about LGBT plus children needing a safe space, which doesn't mean they need to have one teacher they can go to, but it's about creating that culture and that environment about being LGBTQ plus inclusive. So it's enshrined really in these three documents that we've got work to do to make sure that we are inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community within our school settings. The issue comes from sometimes how education and society see the community. So when we think about society and the media, and these are four articles that have come from one newspaper, and they're all from October, so they're all recent documents. And I think it's just worth noting the kind of the play that they use when you think about different parts or different groups within the LGBTQ plus community. So the one at the top there, deliberately calling someone by the wrong gender pronouns may land you in jail for 2 years, 2 years being capital letters, as if that's outrageous. How dare that happen just because they are wrong gender pronouns? Now, of course, this is looking towards the trans and the non-binary community, and almost seeing how that, the impression I get from reading that is that almost seems like that's ridiculous. How can you go to jail just for using the wrong pronouns? So there's a bit of a microaggression coming through there. When we look at the one underneath, then the red one, it's beautiful, same-sex routines. So when we're talking about gay representation, Strictly is way ahead of it. So kind of getting the message from that one that for being gay or being lesbian, so that same sex, what's more seen as more usual, that we see more mainstream in the media at the moment, is that's okay, but being trans and misgendering someone, that's ridiculous. And then when you carry on with that narrative around the trans community, you've got the one there that says, I transitioned in 2012. I've met too many people who regret it. Therapy is crucial. And it's just a really alarming headline when you look at it just by itself and think it's almost setting that narrative that, oh, I can go to prison if I misgender somebody. Oh, people that transition don't really want to do it. They regret it. And then when you add into that, the last one by the famous Harry Potter author says that she'd happily do 2 years in jail if they make it a hate crime to call someone by the wrong pronouns. So we seem to have two conflicting things going on here with the LGBT plus community. If you're gay, that's okay. But if you're trans or non-binary, actually there's a bit of an issue going on here, and there's more of a negative narrative coming through, I would argue, from looking at the media. Now, of course, this is only one, these are 4 snapshots, and there is a lot more in the press, but I think that this is really interesting, the way you look at how just one newspaper is structuring their content and their headlines. So when we think about the media more often, and these 2 statistics come from GLAAD, which is an organization in the United States of America. When you look at sexual orientation of LGBT characters on TV, they are predominantly gay and lesbian. So we've got that similarity coming through. We've got that same sex being usualized. but we don't have that queer identity coming through, or anyone who doesn't identify as gay and lesbian. And then interestingly, when you intersect that with racial diversity, predominantly representation of the LGBTQ plus community is white. So we're basically getting white gay men and we're getting white lesbians coming through. We're not getting that multicultural diversity. We're not getting representation from the Black community, the Latinx community, or even our Indigenous communities. So there's some work to be done there around how the media is portraying stories around the LGBTQ plus community. Back at home, when we look at Pink News, this is an article from March, so a couple of months old now, but it says that Brits believe there are too many LGBTQ plus people and minorities on TV. So, whoa, hang on a minute. Here in the UK, we've got too many of us around. They don't want us. It's almost like get back in your closet a little bit. So there's some real conflict happening in the media and in society around how the LGBTQ plus community is being perceived. Personally, I'd say there's not enough of us on TV. Yes, there's lots of cis white men on TV, but actually we need to make sure there's that real diversity. And certainly Heartstopper is an amazing thing. When you look at Yasmin, who plays Elle, is a brilliant character to have and is played with such depth, I think. I think this is a really interesting one to look at. And this is a study done by Kantar in 2020. And this was asking parents when they thought it was acceptable to teach children about LGBTQ rights. So the important bits to look at are the ones in green. It took a couple of minutes for me to get my head around this. So 60% of parents say that being gay is acceptable. So the green one means they disagree. So in effect, they're saying 60% of parents agree that it is okay to be gay. 59% say it's okay to talk to a 6-year-old about people identifying as a different gender to the gender they were born. So only about 1% difference there. And then when you get to 12-year-olds, you can see it jumps up to 69 and 65%. So our parents, on the whole, seem to be okay with it. But what does the education sector itself say when you look at our curriculum material? Often when we think about our relationships and education documentation and what we talk about when it comes to being LGBT, we talk about the relationship side. We don't talk about the sexual side of things, which from a sexual health perspective has big alarm bells ringing against it. But it also then gets rid of that whole part of life, really. So we talk about just relationships. We can't talk about sex. Safeguarding, LGBTQ plus people we need a safe space. We need it as if we couldn't exist without it. And then the whole conversation about when we teach about LGBTQ rights and how things have improved, it's often in a deficit model. So there's gay marriage as opposed to just marriage equality. We talk about HIV and AIDS and the impact that had in a negative way, and rightly so. It really did in the 80s and 90s. And often we talk about hate crime victims and statistics against the LGBT community. So I would argue from there, really, it's that concept of, well, where are the positive stories coming? Where are we getting that positivity and that sense of it's okay to be gay? Because if all our children are getting is, we don't talk about gay sex, that doesn't exist. You need a safe space, and there's this thing as gay marriage, and you're a victim of hate crime, then it sends a bit of an interesting message out to our children and young people that actually life isn't great to be LGBT. And I think that really silence does speak 1,000 words. So as I kind of alluded to already, it's that absence of representation and visibility. And if we don't see anyone like us, then well, do we exist? If and I went to school during Section 28, if I don't see anyone like me, I really did think at the time that I was to coin a phrase, the only gay in the village. And it's also making sure that we go and are conscious of that dominant diversity, as I like to call it, that we've got our white gay men covered quite well, some would argue, on TV, but where are the other aspects of the LGBTQ plus community? In particular, there is a real thing at the moment around bi invisibility. So when we think about our curriculum and the way that we can improve on things, we can use what's known as windows, doors, and mirrors. I'm going to focus more on windows and mirrors for this session, mainly because of time, but there are certainly ways we can open up doors into the LGBT community as well. So the concept around windows is that it gives children the opportunity to see someone else's world. So I want you to reflect and think, what LGBTQ plus world are you showing your students? And what from that then is their perception or stereotype going to be? So are you only showing those negative side of things? Are you only showing that that the LGBT community are a they, that we're a homogenous group for a start? Or are you showing that there is positivity in the community? So some ways you can look at this really are looking at the texts you use in English. So 2 on here. So this day in June is a great way of looking at the Pride movement as a positive experience. And then And Tango Makes Three, which is obviously for primary age, typically lower, but you can use it further up the school in primary as well. Looking at a really nice story about adoption of 2 penguins that are in a same-sex relationship and adopt an egg because they want to be parents and this egg doesn't have any parents. So some really nice ways there of making it a bit more personal. Now, you can also look at role models and look at the way that you can embed them into your curriculum and just into your school culture. So I've put on the screen for you just 2 that are from collections I've got on my website under the resources section. So Josh Cavallo, yes, I appreciate that he is a gay man and he's a gay man, but he's important because he is a professional football player. And in the world of sport, we know there are some real issues around homophobia, in particular in football. And certainly for children I've worked with who are into their sport and into their football, there is almost a level, and not necessarily with the children, but just in the world of football itself, sometimes there can be that toxic masculinity can come in. So just by children seeing that actually it's okay to be gay in the professional sport world is a really powerful step. And then also looking at a history perspective and a recent history perspective, looking at someone like Sally Ride, who, changes that concept and changes that perception around what it means to be a scientist, and also then not shying away from her identity as a lesbian as well. So there's some small ways there we can have windows into people's lives to see what it's like for them to be LGBTQ. But of course, then we need to also think about our mirrors. So if this is our children and our families and our staff, an opportunity for them to see themselves reflected and also their family dynamic. So there are some wonderful books I've put on the screen for you to have a think about. So All Boys Aren't Blue, which is more of a secondary text, and certainly one I would really recommend reading before you start divulging into it with your students. Wonderfully powerful book about George M. Johnson, who identifies, I think, as queer, but also then has that intersectionality with his ethnicity in there as well, and religion, and really goes into some gorgeous narrative stories around what it's been like for him. It is a New York Times bestseller, but also just to make you aware, it's also one of the most banned books in the States. We know that there are some interesting things happening over the other side of the pond at the moment, but certainly a book to have a look at. And I think he's also got another one out as well. Then you've also got I'm Perfectly Designed by Kamara Brown. You've also got the Heartstopper series. And then I want to draw your attention to the trans community, the 2 images at the bottom. So you've got a book there that's called George, which has been crossed out and is now called Melissa's Story. Beautiful book. I read it over the summer and actually it really made me cry. It's not a big one, and I think that there are parts of it that you could certainly use with upper key stage 2, possibly year 6, as in extracts, where Melissa talks about her journey coming to terms with being trans and what that's like being in school. And then when we think about the role model side of things as well, using posters, so looking at people like Laverne Cox, who is an actress. Again, she's got that intersectionality with her ethnicity and is also a huge advocate for the community. So giving those positive messages around it's okay to be who you are. So if we put all that in place then, and we have these role models in our curriculum and we use these books in our learning, what impact does that have on our students and our staff? So we know, and there's plenty of research around this, that well-being is linked to academic characteristics such as growth mindset and mastery. And these have been linked to higher achievement. So we know that by doing this, we can have an impact on children's attainment, but also it's about their well-being and their mental health. So when our LGBT young people are in a supportive environment, they're 4 times more likely to feel optimistic about their future. When we think about the staff, there's no longer that sense of being hyper visible, that there's no sense of being as much as being in the spotlight. So I know when I've been in situations in the past where I've been the only openly gay member of staff, it can feel like everything has to come to me to deal with that's about being LGBT. Whereas if you've got this kind of culture of it being everywhere, it doesn't always feel like the spotlight is on you all of the time. There's also less need to self-censor. So again, if staff are seeing representation around them, they know that they're in an environment where the school is respectful and accepting of being LGBT. So this is about talking about using pronouns. So if someone is, so yeah, if I was talking about my partner to my class or to another member of staff, I wouldn't need to necessarily always think about what pronouns I'm using. So I could easily say he when I'm referring to my boyfriend, rather than having to say my partner or my friend. So that censorship can be removed. But also, and I know that I started off by talking about Section 28. So Catherine Lee, in her study in 2019, looked at the impact and the legacy of Section 28 and what that had on staff. So for those teachers who were teaching during Section 28, 48% of them reported some type of anxiety or mental health. However, when you look at the teachers post 2003, so once Section 28 had been repealed, that halved to just 24%. So you can see there's a real positive impact on our mental health and our well-being on our staff, which of course is then going to relay into our retention. I was going to say issues, but they're not issues so much if we can improve retention rates in our schools as well. So how do we embed it? What do we go around doing? So we can definitely look at texts that give those windows and those doors and those mirrors into the LGBT community in our curriculum. Now, it's easy to think this is just for English, but you can do it in lots and lots of other subjects as well. So you can put role models and stories into your science curriculum. You can use them in your history curriculum. It's also about using those role model posters. As I said, I've got some on the website that you can dig into as well, that you can feel free to use to put up around your school, just to increase that visibility. Wonderful picture of me there that you can also think about, how do you make it visible in the school community? So this was taken when in a primary school, we looked at doing Pride events during June. So, you know, the big Pride thing there we do Rainbow Friday, and it's not so much about being pride in that sense of LGBTQ plus inclusion, but about teaching our children to be proud of who they are and how they want to embrace and share their identity with the rest of the community. But also you can then engage with the wider events. So LGBT plus History Month is coming up. This is the logo from last year, but it is in February in 2024. And also, Just Like Us organised School Diversity Week, and they have got a wealth of resources on their website. There are loads of ways you can look at embedding LGBTQ plus role models into your schools. So I hope that's been helpful and a bit of a whistle-stop tour around role models in education. I'm going to stop sharing now. I'm going to stop recording now. So if anyone does have any questions, you can ask them without worrying too much about them being recorded for everyone to hear forever. So yes, thank you all so much for coming.